Welcome to Confirmation Class in your Pink Book, Series A. We're at Lesson 2 today on page 5. God tells us about Himself is the theme for today. In this lesson, we're going to learn what different people believe about God. There's some different terms that we're going to learn there. We're going to talk about the natural knowledge of God, the revealed knowledge of God, and also we're going to talk about what does it mean that God is triune, and that'll be on page 6. So let's begin. Let's take a look at page 5. Maybe you're wondering, why in the world am I looking at a screen full of water skiers? And you probably don't know this about me, but throughout my end of high school years and beginning of college years, I was a water skier on a water ski team that was a nationally ranked water ski team, and you happen to be looking at a picture of a world record. All those 36 people are behind one boat. And you might say, wow, that's pretty impressive. But I'm really proud of this picture for a particular reason. Maybe you see the little yellow circle or oval on the bottom right-hand part of the screen. That's me in the pyramid. The last one on the right side that has girls on their shoulder. And that was pretty fun to be a part of. But maybe you wouldn't know that about me unless I told you. And that's what we're going to learn about God today in this lesson number 2. We wouldn't know who God is or anything about God unless He told us. And what's neat is in the Bible, He tells us who He is. He tells us what His promises are for us. And He tells us what we need to know about Him. So that's what we're going to see in this lesson. How does God tell us about Himself? Now, there are some people in this world who don't believe there is a God or wonder if there really is a God. And one of those groups of people are called agnostics. Agnostics, you can think of them with a big question mark on their forehead. They're not quite sure if there is a God or not. They want some proof. Prove it to me that he really or she really exists. And so in your book, you can fill out an agnostic says. And agnostic says, I don't know if there is a God. And you probably should put a question mark at the end of that. They're not sure if a God really exists or not. The next term I want you to know is that of atheist. And an atheist knows for sure in their mind or in their heart that they've decided there is no God. So we can fill that in, that blank. There is no God. And really, when you think about it, that calls for a lot of faith. For a person to look at this world, how it runs, to look at a tree or nature or a baby being born, and to say, I don't believe that there is a God, boy, that calls for a lot of faith or trust. And we saw what that is last time. Faith or trust is believing in something and believing it so firmly that you know it for sure. And some people, because they don't believe in God, just say, boy, he doesn't exist. But really, when you think about it, there's a lot of clues that God has left us to say, no, I really exist and I'm really here. And we're going to start looking at some of those clues. If you go past a construction site, you can know something for sure. That didn't just happen by accident. There were people there that had to pour the concrete for the foundation. There were people there who had to put the 2x4s in place so that a frame for a house could be built. It didn't just happen by magic or by accident, or a tornado didn't happen and that's what was left. It took people to put that together. And so if you see a building project, you know, hey, there were construction workers there. Well, the same is true with God. God has said, I have made things, I've made this world, and that gives you a clue, that's to be a tip-off that I exist. and that I'm really real. And so let's take a look at some passages about that. God says in Psalm 14, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." If someone says there is no God, they're just fooling themselves, because God has left the clues, kind of like the clues at that construction site. You know somebody's been there. And God says, when you look at this world and how it runs, that there's seasons and that there's harvest and that there are more trees and animals and things being born and growing. Those are all tip-offs, God says, that I'm really real, that I really exist, that I'm behind all of those things. So the next part of your book says, all people can know that there is a God from two sources. You have a 1 and a 2, and let's start filling those in. That Psalm passage we looked at says all people can know that there's a God from nature, from looking at the created universe. God says, that's my fingerprint that says I'm real, that shows that I really exist because I made all things. Another passage about that, Psalm 19. The heavens, the skies declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. If you look up into the night sky and see the planets, if you look up and see the clouds, if you look up at the sun and the moon, those are God's handiwork. Those are the things that he has made with his hands. Just go on the internet sometime and look up NASA photographs of space, and you'll just be amazed at the things God has made and come up with. In the extreme north of our world, if you go to Alaska or places like that, the night sky is filled with the aurora borealis, the midnight sun, the northern stars, all those kind of things that just show a great display of lights and color. And it's, again, a tip-off that God's saying, hey, I exist. Look at the wonders that I have done. Another passage that talks about that, Hebrews 3, every house is built by someone. We saw a picture about that earlier. But God is the builder of everything. People might build houses, but here's what God built. A whole world, all made by his hand, custom made for us. There's another tip-off or source that we can look at that shows God's fingerprints in this world, and that's number 2. All people can know that there's a God from another source. And that second source is our conscience. That little voice inside of us that tells us this is right, this is wrong. And no matter who you are, even if you're the most hardened criminal, there's still a conscience in there. There's still this little voice that says, hey, don't do that, or this is okay to do, or you're going to get in trouble for doing that. And that must show us that there's an ultimate good in this world. There's ultimate evil too. That says, these things are wrong. Where does that come from? It comes from a God who wrote those things on our heart to say this is right, this is wrong, and another tip-off that he exists and that he made us. Romans 2 is Paul writing about people who didn't have the law. Jews had the Old Testament law and the Ten Commandments, but Paul's writing there are Gentiles, non-Jews, who didn't have the law. But since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. You don't have to tell somebody you shouldn't murder someone else. They know that that's wrong. You don't really have to tell somebody they shouldn't steal somebody else's stuff. They know that that's wrong. Why is that? Because God wrote that on our heart. He didn't have to spell it out. He did later because people's consciences were getting misguided. But those things are there for us to know on our hearts. So let's define this thing called the natural knowledge of God. We talked about how it comes from nature and conscience. They give us a tip-off that God really exists. Let's fill in the blank. The natural knowledge of God, and you can put this on the right side of the page after the equal sign, is what we can learn about God from nature and from our conscience. You also have a little diagram on the left side of the page, 2 blanks on the top, and then the arrows down, tells me, and then a longer blank. On that top left side, you can put nature, and then on the right side, you can write in conscience. So nature and conscience both tell me that there is a God who is powerful. Boy, just look at nature and you can see that he's powerful. That there's a God who's wise. There's order to this created universe that he made. And that he's holy. There's expectations there of doing right. And if we don't do things that are right, if we do things that are wrong, we feel guilty and we wonder, how do you get on God's good side again? Now, all those things are great. The natural knowledge of God, my nature and conscience tell me that God exists. But there's something that those things don't tell me. Number one, under the weakness of our natural knowledge, it doesn't tell us who the true God is. It doesn't point out to us who God is. It could be the sun, it could be the moon. People have worshipped different things and called it God throughout the centuries. And so just because I believe or I get tip-offs that there's a supreme being out there that made everything, it doesn't tell me who that God is. The second thing that the natural knowledge of God doesn't tell me is that we have a savior from sin. It tells us, our conscience tells us when we mess up, but it doesn't tell us how to get on God's good side again or make up for that sin, or how do we get at peace with God again. I want you to take a minute and grab your Bible and open up to Acts chapter 17. That's in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts chapter 17. And there, from verses 16 to 34, you're going to read a section about Paul preaching to the people of Athens. And the people of Athens had so many gods that they worshipped. Paul said, I want to tell you about another God. And this is the God that made everything. He played up on their knowledge of nature and their knowledge of conscience to show them there is another God, the true God, that I want you to know about. So take a look through that section and read it for yourself. You can pause the DVD while you take a minute to read that. Do you notice the part of Paul's sermon where he says why God gave us this tip-off of nature and conscience? God gives people this natural knowledge to lead them to do something. He wants them to seek after him and to know more about him. He plays up on curiosity to say, I want you to dig in and learn more about who I am and what I'm about and what I want for you. And the next part of the lesson is going to tell us where that comes from. How do we learn more about God? The ultimate way we get to see what God is really like is through him coming for us. And that's what Jesus is about. God came in human flesh and blood to show us what he's like. Jesus was merciful. Jesus was loving. Jesus was forgiving. Jesus had high expectations and said, keep God's commandments. So God shows us what he's really like through Jesus. It's kind of like Jesus puts a face on God to show us what he's like. John chapter 1 says, no one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, but Jesus, who is at the Father's side, has made him known to us.